Colorado, 1887. Grace Whittaker stood at the kitchen stove on an ordinary Tuesday morning, watching her husband cross the yard toward the barn the way he had nearly every morning since they married in 1868, and found herself struck by a thought that stopped her hands mid-motion over the skillet. She could not remember the last time Daniel had simply held her, not brushed past her at the sink, not steadied her elbow crossing the icy porch in January, held her, arms around her. Nothing needed from either of them, no chore waiting on the other side of it. She stood there long enough that the eggs began to catch and still couldn't land on a single morning, a single evening, a single ordinary Tuesday when it had last happened. It frightened her more than she expected it to. Grace was 41 now, Daniel 44. And the two of them had built by any outside measure exactly the kind of marriage most people in the county would point to as proof that hard work and steady love could outlast anything the Colorado frontier cared to throw at a family. They'd married in the autumn of 1868 at 22 and 25 on a claim that held little more than a half-finished cabin. One room enclosed and livable, the second still open to the weather that first hard winter, finished board by board over the following spring as Daniel found time between planting. Grace remembered him carrying her over the threshold of that single unfinished room. Anyway, both of them laughing at how far short it fell of anything either family back east would have called a proper home, and neither of them minding in the slightest. Grace remembered those first years with a fondness that still surprised her. The way Daniel used to whistle while he worked, off-key and entirely unashamed of it. The way they'd sit together on an overturned crate some evenings, too tired to properly cook supper, laughing at nothing in particular simply because they were young. And the whole hard life ahead of them still felt like an adventure rather than a grind. They'd raised 3 children on that same land, buried 2 bad harvests and a hard winter that had taken half their herd, counted pennies more years than either cared to remember. And come out the other side of every one of those trials, still standing, music, still married, still working the same land side by side. From the road driving past on a Sunday, a stranger would have called it a good marriage, a strong one. Grace had believed that too most days. She simply hadn't examined until that Tuesday morning at the stove exactly what the strength had cost them both. Daniel still fixed everything before Grace had to ask. The loose porch step, the sticking pantry door, the wagon wheel that wobbled every spring without fail. Grace still had his coffee ready before he left for the fields, poured strong and black exactly the way he'd taken it since the week they married. They slept in the same bed every night, worked the same land every day, and had done both faithfully for 19 years. But their conversations, Grace realized, standing at that stove, had narrowed somewhere along the way into a small, practical circle. The children, music, the animals, the money, the endless list of what needed doing before winter. She could recite without effort exactly how many bushels the Westfield had yielded last September. She found she could not recite the last thing Daniel had said to her that had nothing to do with any of it. She knew, if she was honest with herself standing there, that the drift hadn't been his doing alone. She thought of the winter Wyatt was born, how exhausted she'd been, how she'd stopped answering Daniel's quiet questions about her day with anything beyond a tired nod. Training him without meaning to that there was little point asking. She thought of the small kindnesses she'd stopped noticing enough to acknowledge until noticing them stopped seeming worth the effort to him too. "Coffee's getting cold," Daniel said, coming back through the kitchen door for his hat. "I know," Grace said. "Eggs caught a little too. Won't mind them," Daniel said. And was gone again before she'd finished setting the plate down, off toward the barn with the same steady, unhurried gait he'd carried across that yard 10,000 mornings before this one. Before we go on, let me pause for just a moment, because there's something true about farm life in the 1880s worth understanding here. On a homestead like the Whitters, labor wasn't divided by affection, it was divided by survival. A husband and wife working a claim this size typically spent 12 to 14 hours a day at separate demanding tasks. Him with the stock, the fields, the heavy building work. Her with the garden, the preserving, the endless mending and feeding that kept a family fed through winter. Historians studying homestead diaries and letters from this era have found something worth sitting with. Many of these marriages functioned day-to-day less like the companionate partnerships we picture in a modern romance music, and more like two people running a small, unforgiving business together full of genuine devotion but with precious little built-in time set aside simply for each other. It wasn't that couples like Grace and Daniel loved each other less. It's that the frontier rarely asked whether the marriage itself was being tended, only whether the farm was. Now let's get back to the Whittakers because Grace has just started asking that very question. Wyatt, their eldest at 18, had taken to spending more evenings in town than at home, and had said more than once that spring that he intended to find work away from the farm entirely once he'd saved enough to make the leave respectable. It was a particular evening in early June that had settled the matter fully in his mind, though he hadn't mentioned it to either parent. He'd come in from the fields to find his mother asking his father whether the Atrix boy had settled on a fair price for the here, and his father answering in the same flat, practical tone he'd have used with any hired hand. Music, the two of them passing an entire supper without once looking up from their plates except to discuss the sale. He'd sat through that supper thinking of the Hendricks place itself, where he delivered a message the week before and found Mr. and Mrs. Hendricks laughing together over some small joke at their own kitchen table. Nothing of consequence being discussed at all, simply two people enjoying each other's company over a meal. He hadn't meant to compare the two households. The comparison had made itself unbidden and stuck with him considerably longer than he expected. Nothing wrong with the farm, Wyatt told Grace one evening not long after, helping her clear supper while Daniel finished the evening chores. I just don't want to spend my whole life the way you and P have spent yours. The comment landed harder than Wyatt likely intended. And how is that exactly? Grace asked, careful to keep her voice light. Wyatt considered his answer a long moment, young enough not to fully understand the weight of what he was about to say. Old enough to say it anyway. Working music, he said finally, just working side by side, same as the mules pull the same plow. I watched you and P talk about that here for the length of a whole supper last week and never once ask each other how the day actually went. I want something more than that, Mama. I don't know exactly what, but more than that. Grace didn't have a ready answer for him that evening, mostly because some part of her had been afraid music, for longer than she wanted to admit that he wasn't entirely wrong. Their daughter Ellie, 17 and full of the particular hopefulness that hadn't yet been worn down by hard winters, had taken to talking about weddings with the breathless seriousness only a girl that age could manage. Dresses, dances, music, the boy 2 farms over who'd started finding excuses to ride past on Sundays. Was it romantic when you and Palm married? She asked Grace one evening, the two of them shelling peas on the porch. Grace considered the question longer than Ellie likely expected. It felt like the whole world at the time, she said finally. Your father used to write me letters music before we married, though we lived only 3 mi apart and could easily have talked in person. Said things in ink he never quite managed to say out loud. What happened to that? I don't rightly know, Grace admitted, surprised by her own honesty. I expect it simply got harder to find once there was a farm and children and every season's worth of trouble standing between us and the leisure to write letters. And I expect I stopped asking for it somewhere along the way, same as he stopped offering it. It's difficult to say now which of us let go of the habit first. Ellie was quiet a moment, young enough to find the answer troubling rather than simply ordinary. I don't want that to happen to me, music, she said. I want whoever I marry to still write me letters when I'm your age. I hope he does, Grace said, and meant it more than the moment let on. She tried that same week to raise the matter with Daniel directly and found the words considerably harder to locate than she'd expected. Do you ever feel like we've stopped talking? She asked him one evening, the two of them lying in the dark, the day's chores finally finished. We talked plenty, music, Daniel said, already half toward sleep. Talked about the Hendricks boy wanting to buy that here just this morning. That's not what I mean. What do you mean then? Grace lay there a long moment. The question sitting unanswered in the dark because she wasn't entirely certain herself how to explain it without sounding like she was accusing him of something neither of them had done wrong on purpose. Nothing, she said finally. Never mind, long day. Daniel was asleep within minutes, same as music, always, and Grace lay awake considerably longer, turning over a loneliness she hadn't expected to feel lying beside the same man she'd shared a bed with for 19 years. She thought, too, of how easily she'd let the conversation drop the moment it grew difficult, the same way she suspected Daniel had let 100 small openings pass over the years, rather than push through the awkwardness of them. It was reorganizing the attic that following week, making room for winter linens, that Grace came across the old trunk she hadn't opened in years, her mother's originally brought west when Grace herself married, filled since with her own modest keepsakes rather than her mother's. She'd meant only to shift it aside to reach the linen shelf behind it, but the latch had come loose with age, and the lid fell open before she could stop it, spilling a soft, musty smell of old paper and cedar into the close attic air. Inside, beneath a folded quilt she'd forgotten she still owned, she found a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon gone soft with age. Daniel's handwriting, careful and young, considerably more open than the man she'd shared a bed with the night before. She read them slowly, sitting cross-legged on the attic floorboards with the afternoon light slanting through the small round window, in no particular hurry to reach the bottom of the stack. I think of you the whole ride home, one letter read, and find the miles pass faster for the thinking. I don't know that I'll ever manage to say this plain to your face, Grace. So I'll trust the paper with it instead. I believe I've loved you since the church social, and I don't much care to spend the rest of my life pretending otherwise. Another shorter written what must have been only days before their wedding. Tomorrow I get to call you my wife, and I mean to spend every day after making certain you never once regret saying yes. Beneath the letters sat a photograph, its edges soft and its colors faded. The two of them, considerably younger, standing stiff and serious the way photographs demanded back then, though Grace remembered laughing the moment after it was taken. Both of them unable to hold the solemn pose a second longer. And beneath that, a length of ribbon, pale blue, that she recognized instantly as the one she'd worn in her hair the night of their very first dance. Grace sat on the attic floor a long while, the trunk opened beside her, and found herself crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in years. Not from sadness exactly, music, but from the strange, aching surprise of meeting a younger version of her own husband on paper. A man who'd once found the nerve to say things Daniel hadn't said aloud to her in longer than she could properly remember. He found her there an hour later, come looking when she hadn't answered his call for supper, and stood in the attic doorway, taking in the scene, his wife on the floor, the old trunk open. The letters spread across her lap. Grace. She held up the letter without a word and watched him cross the small space and sit down beside her, taking it from her hands, reading his own younger words with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in longer than she could name. I wrote that, he said, more to himself than to her. You did. Don't recall the last time I said anything half that plain to you, Daniel said, setting the letter down carefully, as though it might tear from the weight of 19 years sitting on top of it. Neither do I, Grace said. That's rather the trouble I've been sitting with all week, Daniel. I couldn't tell you the last time you held me. Not fixed something for me, not walked beside me to the barn, simply held me the way this letter talks about wanting to. Daniel was quiet a long moment, the ribbon still resting in the trunk between them. When did music we stop? He asked finally. I don't know that we stopped all at once, Grace said. I think we simply got busy one ordinary day at a time until enough ordinary days added up to 19 years and neither of us noticed the exact moment it happened. And I don't think it was only your doing, Daniel. I stopped asking, same as you stopped offering. I'm not laying this at your feet alone. They sat together in that attic considerably longer than either had planned, going through the rest of the trunk slowly. More letters, a pressed flower from some forgotten summer, a hand-drawn map Daniel had once made her of the claim before either of them had set foot on it. Marked with hopeful little notes about where the garden would go, where the porch would face the mountains. I remember drawing this, Daniel said, tracing the faded ink. Sat up half the night trying to picture the whole life before we'd built a single board of it. Did it turn out the way you pictured? Better in most ways, Daniel said. Harder too, in ways I hadn't pictured at all. He looked at her. I don't know that I pictured us talking mostly about years and harvests by year 19, if I'm honest. Neither did I, Grace admitted, though I don't know that either of us chose it on purpose. It simply happened the way most neglect does. Not through any single decision, but through 1,000 small ones, each one reasonable enough on its own. I used to bring you wild flowers, Daniel said suddenly, as though the memory had only just surfaced. That first year, whatever was growing along the fence line, I'd bring a handful in without a word. You did, Grace said, surprised he remembered it too. I kept them in a jar on the windowsill until they wilted, and I always felt a small ache putting the dead ones out. Same as if something were ending. When did I stop? Grace considered the question honestly. Somewhere around the year Wyatt was born, I believe, she said. There wasn't time for wild flowers once there was a baby needing feeding every few hours. I recall being too tired most evenings to properly thank you for the ones you did bring near the end of it, and I expect that discouraged you faster than the lack of time did. What do we do about it now? Grace considered the question a long moment. I don't rightly know, she said. I expect it isn't a thing that mends in a single evening, however much I'd like it to. But I'd like to try, Daniel. I'd like us to talk about something besides the farm, at least some evenings. I'd like to remember what your hands felt like around me for a reason besides work. I'd like that too, Daniel said, and reached for her hand there on the attic floor, an ordinary, uncomplicated gesture that felt to both of them considerably larger than it looked. Wyatt and Ellie both noticed over the following days a small but unmistakable shift in the house. Their parents lingering at the table after supper instead of scattering immediately to separate chores. A quiet laugh from the kitchen some evenings that hadn't been there before. Daniel coming in from the fields some afternoons simply to find Grace rather than to report on the day's work. Something's different, Ellie said to her brother. The two of them shelling corn on the porch. Reckon so, Wyatt said. Can't rightly say what though. I think they found something in that old trunk. Ellie said Mama's had it out twice this week, and she gets a look on her face after. Like she's remembering something she'd rather not have forgotten in the first place. Neither of them said anything further about it, though both noticed, without quite naming it, music that the house had begun to feel a little less like a well-run farm and a little more like a home two people actually chose to share. It was a Saturday evening some weeks later, the children occupied with their own affairs, that Daniel did something he hadn't done in longer than either of them could say. He pushed the kitchen table quietly toward the wall after supper, the legs scraping softly against the floorboards, clearing the floor in a way that made Grace look up from the dishes with open curiosity. Daniel, what are you doing? He didn't answer right away. He crossed to the old cabinet where they kept odds and ends neither of them had the heart to throw away, and came back holding a small battered music box Grace hadn't seen in years. A wedding gift from her own mother, music its tune long since gone silent from disuse, tucked away so long ago that Grace had half forgotten they still owned it at all. I found this back of the cabinet looking for something else entirely, Daniel said. Recognized the tune the moment I wound it part way, though it took me the better part of an hour after that to place exactly where I knew it from. He wound it carefully now, and the old melody came out thin and halting at first, the mechanism stiff with disuse, then steadier. The same tune, Grace realized with a start, that a fiddler had played the night of their very first dance. Music back when Daniel was still a boy, trying to work up the nerve to ask her properly, standing at the edge of a crowded church social with his hat in his hands. Looking exactly as uncertain as he did now, standing in their own kitchen. 19 years later, he held out his hand. Grace looked at that hand for a long moment. The same hand that had built their house, mended their fences, and she understood now plainly music, had simply forgotten somewhere along the way how to reach for her without a reason attached to it. You remembered, she said, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. Daniel didn't answer with words. He simply drew her gently toward him, the old tune winding down slow around them, and held her the way the letter in the trunk had once promised he always meant to, for no reason beyond wanting to. They danced there in the kitchen, clumsy and slow and entirely unhurried, Daniel's boots catching once against the table leg. They hadn't moved quite far enough, both of them at the near stumble instead of minding it. 19 years of small neglect finally making room for something neither of them had realized how badly they'd missed. "I'd nearly forgotten how well you dance," Grace said, her head resting against his chest the way it had that very first night. "Only ever practiced with one partner," Daniel said. "Reckon that's why I still remember the steps." The farm didn't change in the weeks that followed. The chores remained the same. The conversations about hears and harvests didn't disappear entirely. And neither Grace nor Daniel pretended that one dance in the kitchen had undone 19 years of drifting apart, one reasonable decision at a time. But Daniel started leaving small notes some mornings, tucked under her coffee cup, nothing more than a line or two. "Thinking of you on the ride out, same as I used to." Grace started walking out to meet him at the fence some evenings instead of waiting for supper to draw him back inside, simply to have those few extra minutes of his company before the day's demands. Reclaim them both. They made a habit too of the small things neither had thought to name a habit before, a hand on the small of the back in passing. A cup of coffee poured for two and drunk slowly on the porch some mornings before the chores began. 10 quiet minutes neither of them would have made time for a season before. "You're doing it again," Grace told him one morning, catching him watching her across the kitchen the way he used to before either of them had gray in their hair. "Doing what? Looking at me like there's somewhere else you'd rather be less." "Can't help it," Daniel said. "Seems I forgot how much I liked doing it until I remembered." Wyatt left for Denver that following spring, same as he'd planned, though he wrote home more often than either parent expected. And remarked once visiting that Christmas that his parents seemed to actually enjoy each other's company in a way he didn't fully remember from his boyhood. "Don't know what changed," he told Ellie privately, "but I like it better this way." "They found an old trunk," Ellie said. "I think it reminded them of something they'd forgotten to keep." Ellie married the boy from the farm too over 2 years later, once he'd finished building a house of his own to bring her to music, and asked her mother the night before the wedding what advice she had for a marriage meant to last as long as her parents had. "Don't wait 19 years to notice you've stopped holding each other." Grace told her the farm will still be there in the morning. The holding won't. Music wait quite so patiently. Grace kept the old letters in the trunk still, though she took them out now and then, not out of sorrow, but simply to remember on ordinary evenings the particular sound of a young man's voice on paper, promising a life he'd since spent 19 years quietly, imperfectly, and lovingly building exactly as he'd promised, even on the years they'd both forgotten for a while. To notice they were still keeping that promise together. Grace Music and Daniel Whitaker never stopped loving each other, not for a single day of their 19 music years together. They simply let the daily work of surviving quietly crowd out the music, daily work of loving the way it does for so many marriages. Not through any single failure on either side, but through 1,000 reasonable choices, music made by both of them that added up slowly to a distance neither one meant to create. What music they learned sitting in an attic with an old trunk between them was that a marriage isn't only built once at the music start. It has to be found again sometimes in the same house after the same 19 years by music, the same two people who never actually stopped wanting to be found. Music. May God bless each and every one of you who listen today. Until next time, keep writing. We built these walls with tired hands. Music raised our children. Work this land. Music. Watch 19 winters come and go, and somewhere in the years we forgot what we used to know. You were still there beside my bed, still fixing every singing board music and step. But love grew music and singing, quiet beneath the weight of all the things music we thought could never singing. Wait, so music hold me like you did before. Like there ain't a single chore more music important singing than this moment and the heart you're holding music close. Let tomorrow find its way, we have given it enough today. Thank the Lord love music didn't leave. It was singing, waiting here for you, music and me. After all these singing years and all we've music known, I'm still here in singing your arms. And I'm music, finally home, an old music, blue ribbon, letters singing tide, young words we thought we'd left behind, a faded picture in a cedar music chest. Brought back the parts of us music that time had put to rest. You wrote you'd music, spend your singing whole life through making sure I never regretted music, choosing you. And though the music and singing years made words grow few, every music fence you mend still said, I love you. So hold me like music you did before, like there ain't a singing single chore. More music important than this moment, and the heart your music and singing holding close. Let tomorrow find its way, we have given it enough music today, thank the Lord love didn't leave. It was waiting music here for you and me. After music, all these years and all we've known, I'm music still here and singing your arms, and I'm finally home. Music, maybe love doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it just grows quiet music through the singing years. Sometimes music, grace, is an old familiar tune. A music, kitchen floor, and two hearts singing, making room. And maybe music, God was gentle all along, keeping something music and singing living when we thought it gone. Till we slowed down long singing enough to music see. The greatest gift was still you singing here with me, so hold me like you did before, we don't need singing anything more. Let the whole wide world music keep turning, we can leave it at the door. There'll be fields music to tend someday, there'll be singing work when morning breaks. But music, tonight I thank the Lord for every year his music, mercy gave. And if silver fills our hair and these music and singing, old hands aren't quite as strong, I'll still know where I belong. Here singing beside you, here where love is carried on. After music, all these years and all we've known. Singing, I'm still music, here singing in your arms and music, I'm finally home. Let the lamp music and singing burn tonight. Let the old music and singing house rest in quiet. The years music and singing may take so much as they move on, but they never took our love. It was here all along, oh my.